For joining in this MSDI Research Seminar, which I'm really happy to have Mitzi Bolton today as a distinguished speaker. So many of you on the call will know Mitzi as our enthusiastic colleague who joined MSDI maybe about half a year ago, maybe a bit longer. So Mitzi just joined right before COVID happened, so she's never really been in our office, only for her interview. So not many of you will have met her in person. So Mitzi is working on our interdisciplinary research project that is looking into the governance of AI and sustainable development, particularly related to the Sustainable Development Goals. And some of you might have joined or heard about the webinar that we held last week that Mitzi helped very well in terms of organization, but also presenting her own project there. If you haven't seen it, just check it out. It should be on YouTube. We should do a bit of advertising around it. It's really excellent webinar. So today, Mitzi will speak not about that project in particular, but more about her own PhD research. So before Mitzi joined MSDI, she initially worked for about 10 years as a public servant, both federal as well as state environments. And she told me she got a bit frustrated, I guess, about the fact that it's so difficult to actually realize sustainable development in a public policy environment, or anywhere else for that matter, I would say. And that led her to do a PhD then at ANU to look into the factors, if you like, the processes that actually drive public decision makers to make public decisions. And that's a whole range of factors that influence each other, but also the outcome of those processes. So this is the topic that Mitzi will speak about today. And I'm happy to hand over to Mitzi now for her talk. The floor is yours, Mitzi.
Let's get sharing, although you've kind of just covered everything that I'm going to cover, so we can probably stop now.
Sorry about that.
No, that's fine. All right, I'm going to assume that everybody can see my slides and get going. So as Rob just mentioned, I'm a scientist turned policymaker turned public admin and sustainable development researcher. And today I'll be largely presenting on my PhD that I did at the ANU. Before I get into that though, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we're all joining on from today. In particular, I would like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people, who are the traditional custodians of the land I'm joining from, but also the Ngunnawal people, who are the traditional custodians of the land that the Australian National University, where I did a lot of the PhD, sits. And I'd like to pay my respects to all elders past, present and emerging. So let's get into the thesis, hey? So 3 decades ago, the international community agreed that sustainable development ought to underpin or at least inform public decision-making. Defined as development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs, it's a concept that seeks to consider all sectors across space and time. And it's really appealing to me because I gravitate towards holistic and integrated decision-making. So since then, I'm clearly not the only person that it appeals to. Since Our Common Future came out, there have been numerous international documents and fora reaffirming that position and setting out pathways to achieve it. And Australian governments have committed to the concept, its principles and the associated goals, not only in intergovernmental agreements and strategies, but also enshrining them in primary and subordinate legislation. These are just a few examples. There are more examples out there, so you can go looking for them if you want. But despite these global, national and local commitments, the desired outcomes haven't been forthcoming. And if you attended the presentation last week, I apologize for the next slide. It's just one slide that's the same. So we're seeing that mankind has exceeded or is in danger of exceeding the physical finite limits of the planet. And inadequate recognition of that has pushed us, some would say, into a new geological age. We're seeing recurring bleaching of the Great Barrier Reef, which is one of Australia's most valuable tourism commodities and environmental wonders. And that's due to both global and local policies. Literally thousands of scientists have argued that despite 40 years of global climate negotiations, with few exceptions, we have generally conducted business as usual and have largely failed to address the predicament. And we're seeing that here in crippling, record-breaking droughts and more frequent and intense bushfires that are occurring out of season and in places that you wouldn't typically expect bushfires, like rainforests. We're also seeing Australians becoming increasingly unhealthy with obesity and other non-communicable or preventable lifestyle diseases on the rise. And you don't sort of need to take this cherry picking of facts as the sole argument here though. Alan et al. And some of that et al. Are people at MSDI undertook some work to have a look at Australia's progress toward the targets as part of the SDGs and found we're only on track for about a third of them. And we were doing well on a number of those before the SDGs even came into being. So it's concerning that we're not enhancing our progress there. We're also saying, if you look at the SDGs more generally, we're also saying that we're not largely on track for them either. So these are the high income country scorecard from earlier this year, and 3 out of the 17 goals are looking promising, which is not great. So in short, while there are positive attempts to move us forward, there really is a gap between the aspirations for sustainable development that we've set and the reality that our public decisions have led to. So for me, this manifested itself in an interdepartmental policy reform that was 2 decades in the making. All the ducks were lined up. We had all the stakeholders on board, and yet still the organisational and stakeholder objectives, which were in line with sustainable development principles, were unable to be met. And as Rob mentioned, I found that deeply frustrating, and it kind of really led to a lot of soul searching about where am I going, why am I doing this role? And I had a lot of questions with senior officials that I deeply respect, who were saying, yes, we ought to be applying the principles here, but we can't get these reforms through if we do, and we really need to get these reforms through. So confident that my experiences weren't isolated and it wasn't just this one policy that this was happening in, that led me to wonder, what's influencing public decision makers when they're trying to get sustainable development into public decisions? And I take a really broad view of what is a public decision. So put another way, if public decision makers are saying they want to achieve these outcomes, they want to achieve sustainable development, why aren't we getting there? So within that kind of overarching research question, there's sort of 3 subsidiary questions. The 3 things I was really trying to get at here were, does the assumption that people recognise sustainable development as a common goal hold? And will the SDGs help improve that? What is it that gets in the way of public decision makers when they're trying to achieve these goals? What might help them? And then lastly, if we can identify some of those barriers and enablers, is there a framework that might help decision makers to navigate them, to make the most of them? So that was sort of the 3 things that I was really looking at throughout the thesis and that I'll talk to throughout the rest of the presentation. So to answer that, I of course did the literature review, and my review was really searching for those barriers and enablers, trying to find out what might be driving decisions to where they are. And I found a lot of barriers and enablers to decision making, not necessarily decision making in the public sector, but just decision making in a general sense. But they're typically discussed in isolation. There's whole schools of thought around, one influence. And there's little that draws them together to have a look at the synergistic and antagonistic effects of coexisting factors. And I found really very little on the practitioner experiences. So I set about to change that. I undertook 35 interviews with current or former public servants from Victoria. It covered all of the departments that were in place at that time, and was from senior policy officer level up. Within that group of 35, people fell into one of 3 categories. So either they were being interviewed on their general decision-making kind of approaches, or they were being interviewed on 1 of 2 case studies. So the first case study was the EREP program. So that's the Environment Resource Efficiency Plans program. And it required that entities using more than 100 terajoules of energy or 120 megalitres of water had to identify and implement efficiency mechanisms that had a 3-year or less payback period. And I really liked that project because I felt like it was a good example of sustainable development being embedded in a public policy. The other decision that I used as a case study was the Victorian Channel Deepening Project, and it sought to increase the depth of the shipping channels in Port Phillip Bay to allow larger hulled ships, which were popular at that time, to get into the Port of Melbourne, which is Australia's largest port. So that second project I selected because I didn't think sustainable development had really influenced where it had gone. And despite it winning a number of international awards, there's sort of community feeling or vibe toward it seemed to be not such a positive one, largely because of the first environmental effects study failing into it, and then that kind of feeding into a whole lot of other things. So that was my second case study, the kind of anti-case study of EREP. So I interviewed these people on their decision-making practices and approaches, and then after I'd done that sort of general discussion, we'd shift into sustainable development so as not to prime them. And then I took their responses that had been qualitatively analysed and built a survey that was open again to public servants within Victoria. And again, all of the departments were represented, and this time we had policy officers up sort of responding. So that's kind of how I went about things. Let's kind of jump into what I found. So as I said, the second half of the interviews and the surveys were about the sustainable development side of things because I didn't want to prime people. But the first question that I asked in that section was, are you familiar with sustainable development? And you can see here that, and this is the survey data, that everybody was. In fact, 85% of people felt that they could have a barbecue conversation about it. And the barbecue conversation was used as a bit of a yardstick because as a public servant, you're often given key messages so that when you're at a barbecue with family or friends and people say, oh, what do you do for a job? Or how's it going at the EPA? You've kind of got the key messages and you can confidently talk to them. So the fact that 85% of people said, yep, I can have a barbecue conversation about sustainable development is really encouraging. It means that they feel confident that they can talk to it more or less with people and have some sort of, ongoing dialogue. So that's great. They're comfortable with it. The next question then is, well, what are they actually talking about when they are talking about it? So normally, as the researcher, I would define the key concepts, but it was really important for me, as I said in that first question, to know how other people were conceptualizing it, because that's what's going into their work. So I got some good responses, initial gut responses, and then I got a whole lot of different kind of responses that often overlapped, and I summarized those down. So there were kind of 7 key responses that people gave. They'd normally give one of these 7, often they'd give overlapping bits and bobs of them. And you can see that there's a bit of a focus on the environment. There's a bit of a focus on development per se. There were some people that would literally define the words. They go sustainable, so that's this, development, so that's that, and that's how they'd arrive at their definition. And then you can see that there's also some that are a bit more common within the popular culture, things like Elkington's triple bottom line or the Brundtland Commission's definition there. So there were sort of 7 key definitions that were coming from the interviewees. And I took those and I presented them to the survey participants and asked them to rank each one on how strongly they agreed with them or not. And you can see that when they were put to people, even though there'd been a lot of disagreement, well, not disagreement, it's the wrong word, but variation in responses from the interviewees, the survey participants overwhelmingly supported the Brundtland Commission definitions. So 98% of people agree or strongly agree with it. So we might be able to mobilize people around that definition if we wanted a single definition. And now it's a bit contentious to say that you would want a single definition, because some people see that the beauty of sustainable development is that it isn't tightly defined and that people can find in it what they want. However, the need for a consensus definition or a clarity of what we're trying to achieve became really apparent when I asked people, how well do you think sustainable development is embedded in the decisions you've been involved with? So this is their response to that question. And you can see that even though they're familiar with it, even though they have a definition, regardless of what it is, they have a definition that they think is right, they don't see it being embedded so well in their public decisions. And when I look in more detail at the free text responses of the survey participants and the interviewee comments, it did seem that the lack of consistency around what we're trying to achieve, as well as infrequent or absent definition of sustainable development within primary and subordinate legislation, was creating uncertainty around the level and the content of commitments to sustainability at the organisation level. So people weren't sure what they were actually trying to embed, and that was making it difficult for them to argue for it. So that's kind of where we're at with the concept of sustainable development. Let's now turn to the goals. So here's the same question: how familiar are you with the SDGs? And this was the response in early 2018. I have to say we're asking the same question through a current survey, and I'm getting very similar response. So it doesn't seem like things have moved that far in the last 2 years or so. And what we can see here is that now there's only about 1/3 of people who feel they can have that barbecue conversation. And similarly, there's just under 1/3 of people who said that they're not familiar with them at all. And so those people weren't asked any additional questions about the SDGs. But we can see, I guess, the key thing to take from this is that it's quite a different story to the concept. The goals aren't there in the consciousness as much. So if we then turn to that question around embedding and the likely impact on decision-making in their organisation, there's a whole lot of different things that people were asked, and I'm just going to point you to a few key ones. So keeping in mind that only the 2/3 of people who said they had some level of familiarity were asked this question, it's quite interesting to me that there's consistently about 1/3 of people who neither agree nor disagree with any of the provocations. And so to me, that says they either have a poor understanding of decision-making within their organisation, or they have a poor understanding of the goals. And given that the average length of service is over 12.7 years, it would seem that it's pretty likely that they understand decision-making within the public sector and their organisation, and it's perhaps the goals they don't understand. And that probably comes out a bit more if we look at some of the other key lines here. So you can see that there's agreement, strong agreement from some, that the goals will align with the public decision-making outcomes of their organisation, and that's supported by people disagreeing that they'll be directly considered. So they think they'll align, they don't actually have to look at them in great detail. That was fleshed out in some of the quotes that I got from people. So this is an executive director at the Department of Premier and Cabinet in Victoria. And essentially what he was saying was that he doesn't believe the policies that they come up with are any less worthy for not considering the SDGs. He thinks they'll get to the same kind of outcomes anyway, and that there is an alignment there. And that came through not just from that person, but from a number of people. And it's problematic on a number of levels. One, because there is variation in definition. So people were taking their definition of sustainable development and that was giving them sort of false confidence that they knew what the goals were. And if we're all thinking about sustainable development differently, then they're probably all thinking about the goals differently. So that's one issue. But a bigger issue that I see here, and a more important one perhaps, is that this notion that things will simply align highlights a lack of awareness of the targets and the indicators that sit within the goals. And that suggests that while people might have heard of them, that sort of interaction with the beautiful, colourful postcard might be where people kind of stop when they're thinking about the goals. And so that's potentially going to be a bit of a struggle to help us get a bit more progress on them. If we turn now to the bottom, you'll see there's a whole lot of things here that have an HNI, which is have no impact. And so there's a double negative coming up, I apologise. We can see that there's a large number of people who disagree that they'll have no impact. So they agree that they will have an impact. But they're not agreeing on where or why they'll have that impact. And so for me, that also supports the argument that I'm putting forward that there's a lack of awareness and a lack of understanding of what the SDGs represent. And so a bit more work needs to be done here if we're wanting to see them embedded within public decision making. And it's potentially unlikely that the goals will help with the concept more generally being embedded, which again, we might want to talk about in the Q&A. I'm not sure, we'll keep going. So I'm getting a bit of a sense of how people conceptualize and apply sustainable development and the SDGs and why, but that sort of led to more questions about, well, why do they think this? What's influencing in that way? What might be most important in getting them to think about sustainable development and embed it in the public decisions? So for that, we started to turn to the qualitative analysis of the interviews. As I mentioned, I first did a literature review and went and had a look for the different factors that could be out there. And then I refined that once I went through the interview, went through the transcripts and was undertaking that analysis. So there's a bit of a list there, and it probably feels a little bit unstructured at the moment, but actually what I'm trying to do here is bring some structure to the collection of ideas that I found. And so I applied Stephen Covey's circles of interest and control. For those of you who are unfamiliar with that work, it's pretty commonly discussed within the management literature, and Covey argues that we each have a circle of interest, which includes all the things that we're interested in. But they're trying to focus on all of those things in a haphazard way yields poorer outcomes. Instead, he argues that we should focus on our circle of control, which is a far smaller circle, and exercise real impact on the things that are in that. And that through doing that, our circle of control will gradually increase so that we can take in more things. So I position the barriers and enablers that I found within the literature and through talking to public servants here within that, because I think it gives us a sense of how much the individual decision maker can actually drive change in particular areas, where they can actually drive influence. So that's helpful. It gives us some insights, but it doesn't really help us narrow down what's most important and where we should focus our efforts. And for that, we really need some metrics. So I took the transcripts and put them into NVivo, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, to undertake inductive thematic analysis. And that resulted in 142 themes common to public decision-making practice. And then I aggregated those themes to 40 influences. The 40 was not a predetermined number. If I could have had a predetermined number, it would have been like 5 or 10. But I didn't want to take it down anymore because I was starting to lose the depth of insights that people had shared. So that was where I stopped. You'll see that there's 2 matrices here. They were extracted from that inductive thematic analysis. So the top one would show how often a specific individual would speak to a particular theme, and the bottom one shows how often a particular theme was spoken about in conjunction with another theme. And that comes to the fore as we talk through the 3 kinds of analysis that I did to try to triangulate which were the top and key influences out of the 40 that I just showed you in the big blue circles. And initially going into this, I thought that the more that people talked about something, that probably means it's more important. You know, if they're talking about it a lot, it's probably quite important to them. So if we start to turn to some of the data, this is how frequently people talk to things. And you can see there's a real outlier there in terms of the personal characteristics of decision makers. This is their motivations, their drivers, their experiences, what causes them to do what they do. That was talked about a lot. And then you can jump down into the bulk of things. But you can kind of see as well that if you look at 3 to sort of 6, they're all very similar numbers, and really the differences there are more noise than anything. So having this one method gives us some indications, but it's not really giving us the full picture, and it's not giving us different perspectives. So now we're going to jump into that. And I should say also, for the next few slides, you'll see in the top right-hand corner, if your picture isn't obscuring it, that I've kept the kind of methods overview, so you can see which parts of that methods flow I'm referring to when I'm doing it. So let's jump into some other approaches. I used statistical analyses to kind of compare different cohorts of different individuals. So if you consider the little jelly Lego people to be the baseline across all participants, I then compared that with their averages across different cohorts. So there was a cohort comparison against the different types of decision makers. So you've got your general decision makers, your channel deepeners, and your EREP participants. I compared the baseline against people's seniority within the public sector. So you've got your senior officials who are your secretaries, your CEOs, your commissioners, and you've got your higher level officials who are your directors and executive directors. And then you've got your mid-level officials who are your managers, team leaders, senior policy officers. And then the last cohort analysis that I did actually wasn't planned early on, but it became apparent that it was potentially interesting as I went through. And that was people's outlook and approach to decision making, whether they were sort of upbeat or they're feeling a bit downhearted about it. And I'll explain that in more detail in a minute. So let's get into the results. For the interview type, there was quite a lot of variability. And so there was actually only one statistically significant difference between the different groups, but let's have a look at them anyway. You've probably noticed that for the EREP participants there in the kind of purpley lilac color, there's some, they've tended to focus on some things far more than the channel deepeners and the general decision makers. They were talking about implementation, engagement, the commitment to the sustainable development concepts, and the appetite for change. Particularly if you recall back, this was a requirement on businesses to implement efficiency mechanisms. So they were being mandated to do something. So that appetite for change was really something that had to be overcome. The other thing that stands out, if you look at the channel deepeners, is around complexity. It was a large scale infrastructure project with a lot of very interested stakeholders, collaboration and public decision making processes that was very process driven, and that sort of impacted on the leadership or lack of leadership conversation. Everyone knew what their role was and who was doing what, so they just focused on getting on with it. But also the economics. I was told several times that it was a blank checkbook. They just needed to get it done. It was important to the government that they get it done. So economics wasn't a key issue for them. The one thing that was statistically significant was how much more general decision makers talked about the personal characteristics, their motivations, than did the EREP participants, who tended to focus more on the collegiate nature of that program and working with people to deliver these sustainable development outcomes. So that was quite interesting. If we shift to the seniority of role, things get a bit more significant because there's less variability in the data set. So for our mid-level officials, they were speaking to implementation and appetite for change far more so than the senior officials. That makes sense. They're on the ground, they're the street level bureaucrats having the conversations with the people that have to do things. And they weren't thinking about cognitive biases as much, nor were they thinking about the overall processes or their personal characteristics. So that tells us a bit about the people at that level. The higher level public servants were also quite interesting. There's not so much that's statistically significant here other than resources. They were not focused on it. So the directors and exec directors were talking about it far less than the senior officials and the mid-level officials. And they also focused on governance and framing a little more. And then our senior officials were talking more to the relationship between the bureaucracy and parliament and also leadership. But leadership's quite nice if you can see the detail depending on how big your screen is. It jumps up a little more each time you go another higher level up the public sector rungs. So I found that quite nice. Shows that it kind of, what I'm showing clearly works because it reflects life. And then the last group was this split between people that were more or less upbeat. So the more upbeat people tended to focus on leadership and their personal characteristics statistically significantly more than the less upbeat people. And what I mean by that, they were talking about leadership in terms of I as the individual. It wasn't, I have a title, therefore I'm a leader. It was, anyone can lead from anywhere, kind of like the Ratatouille, anyone can be a chef, anyone can be a leader. And so given the same set of circumstances, because this wasn't correlated with seniority as I just showed you, given the same set of circumstances, some people would be like, well, I can influence this. You know, this is where I work and I can push here and push there and I've done it before and we get these outcomes. And I'm confident that if I try something, you know, maybe 9 times out of 10 it's going to fail, but that one time I'm going to get it through. And so they were kind of the upbeat people. And then the other less upbeat people, they tended to focus more on the appetite for change, institutions, and the public decision-making considerations. And so they would say, well, this is my role, this is what I can influence, and I would really like to get sustainable development across the line, but I'm constrained, I'm pushed in by these things. There's only so much space that I can work in. So, you know, ho-hum. And so, as I said, this was something that came about. I realized this difference as I started to analyze the data. So it was not possible for me to put in place something that was a bit more objective in terms of splitting people, but it was very clear when listening to the audio, when reading through the transcripts, the tone and the words people were using and the way that they were describing things clearly separated people into two groups. And so that was quite interesting for me. And we'll come back to this in a few more slides. So if we put that all together, you can get this quite confusing table which ranks, say, roughly the top 10 influences for people. The main thing to take from this is that those personal characteristics, which had ranked really highly when we just did the raw numbers, again, rate highly across a lot of cohorts here. And same with public decision-making considerations. They consistently, or almost consistently, rank second. But those EREP participants, the people that were involved in the case study that were selected because it did reflect sustainable development, see the world quite differently. For them, as we've just discussed, appetite for change and the commitment to sustainable development were most important. And that was followed by engagement and implementation. And if you look at the bottom of your screen in the middle there, you'll see that implementation ranked 4th for the EREP participants, but was 29th for the general participants and 30th for the channel deepeners. So there's a really large disparity in the way that they were seeing that. So you might want to conclude that personal characteristics and public decision-making considerations are really important, perhaps the most important, but it would seem that from looking at the EREP participants that might be a bit foolhardy, because their data is showing that the predominant influences for them are very different. And it might be that actually, if we want to achieve more sustainable outcomes, we need people to be thinking like the EREP participants rather than thinking like everybody else. So that's a bit of a hypothesis there that I'd like to be able to test at some point in the future, but it was something that stood out really strongly for me in the data. So that's great, but again, more questions. How are all these influences linked? How, you know, is there some sort of synergistic or antagonistic effect? Are people thinking about them in clumps of things? Is that presumption that I have that the most frequently coded ones are the most important ones? You know, there was some overlap in that last slide, but it didn't all overlap. And are there smaller ones that could also be important? And for that, I turned to a network analysis. So I used a program called Gephi, which is free, it's online. It's pretty easy to use, but it has some Java difficulties. So I'd encourage you, if you ever want to do network analysis, to give it a shot, but just be aware you'll have to use a weird version of Java. Anyway, Basically what I did with this was to take the influences, so using that second table that had been extracted from the inductive thematic analysis, I took the influences against the influences and I uploaded those as the nodes in my network. And then I uploaded the relationship between the influences, so the counts, how frequently these things had been discussed together. I uploaded those as their edges within my network. And this is what I got. So I used an algorithm that's been developed by Fruchterman and Reingold, and there's lots of different algorithms that you can use, but this one appealed because I had a comparatively smaller data set than is sometimes used in network analysis. And it also focuses on what I was interested in, which was the strength and importance of the connections between the nodes, or in this case, influences. So here you can see, yep, cool, it's pretty tight network. Sort of looks like a bit of a mess though, like you're probably sitting there going, great, it's a great big ball of grey. But it's sort of not where things stop. So with network analysis, you can start to colour things and make things look prettier. So the thick lines and the lighter coloured lines, they highlight stronger relationships between things, whereas the thinner, darker coloured lines indicate weaker relationships. So that's useful because it tells us that if we were to have a look at personal characteristics, we'd also want to have a look at leadership. The two are quite closely related. So if we were going to try to focus on altering or enhancing in some way the personal characteristics of decision makers to get different outcomes, we'd also want to have a look at leadership. They're really neatly tied together. However, we could probably stick media to the side because it's kind of loosely linked. It can probably be considered almost largely in isolation. So this gives us a sense of where some of those interconnections are and where we need to start thinking about things together. The other thing that we can do with network mapping is some additional statistical analysis. So for example, one of those things is the importance of the individual node or influence to the overall functioning of the network. And for that, I use something that's called betweenness centrality, which is a measure of the shortest path traveled between nodes based on particular algorithms that I won't get into. So those nodes or influences with greater betweenness centrality are highlighted here with bigger circles, and I've colored in the equal first in green, and then the second in red, and the third in blue. So that's your top 10. Essentially, they're the Kevin Bacons of the network. They're the things that everything else has to pass through and that kind of ensure that the system operates properly. So interestingly, this brings up some of those things that were ranked more lowly when we did the statistical analysis and looked at the total counts. So implementation, which we just talked to in regard to the e-wrappers, it's coming up here within the top 10 of things that are counted within that sort of Kevin Bacon measure of importance to the network. And the other one that comes up as well is risk, which ranked 26th on average in that statistical ranking. So what this kind of suggests is that even though decision makers across the board didn't necessarily discuss these things in great detail, they all did mention them. And that suggests that even though they're maybe not front of mind, they probably have a key role in how things are occurring. And we need to take consideration of them in coming up with different solutions as we go forward. The other fun thing that we can do once you've done all of the stats that you need to do is start shifting things around. And so I rearranged things to reflect that Covey circles diagram. And you can see from this that a number of the most mentioned things like personal characteristics, which is right in the middle, it's got a grey circle, and the public decision-making considerations, which is sort of up in that top left with the green circle, they're within people's circle of control, that yellow dotted line, or where that generally sits based on what the literature had described, where things kind of sit. However, we can also see that there's a number of key influences that came up through that network mapping that are on the periphery of the circle of control, if the placement is as it was described in the literature. And so that might support the hypothesis that those who believe that they can drive change to do so, those more upbeat over people going, yeah, I can try and influence here, and if I get it through 1 time in 10, I'm happy with that. They might be able to achieve more, even if objectively their abilities to drive change are actually no greater than their less optimistic peers. And so by that, what I mean is this. Self-confident and more driven people might be interpreting a greater number of things to be within their control or potentially within control. And through that might actually be expanding their circle of control. Whereas those who don't believe that they can have that impact might actually be finding that their circle of control shrinks, and it sort of becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy that they think they can't have much influence, and so therefore they don't. So again, another really interesting finding for me that explained a lot about what I had seen in the public sector and what people were telling me through the interviews. It also led to more questions, yay. So if things are linked, where do we intervene? You know, do we start with the leadership? Do we start with the personal characteristics? If things are on that boundary, can we actually really drive change? Because the public sector isn't filled with robots. It's filled with different people with different personalities and approaches to things. And should we be trying to encourage people to expand that circle of control? So some people would react really strongly to the suggestion that public servants should be encouraged to try to influence decisions. Some people would say that's not the role of a public servant. So there's a bit of a philosophical conversation to be had there about, yeah, is that appropriate for them to be doing that? So a few more questions. Still not really at the bottom of what's most important and where can we try to affect change. So I decided to go and have a look at some systems thinking. As many people at MSDI will be aware, there's lots of different approaches that you can take to systems thinking. The one that really worked for me, or that resonated with me, was the work of Donella Meadows. I'm just going to briefly describe that now. If you're not familiar with her work, I would recommend having a look at the paper or the book that was released after her death. But basically, she argues that there are 12 leverage points within any system, and that the closer that you get to the leverage point 1, the one at the top there, the harder it is to employ that leverage point. But if you're successful in employing it, the greater impact you'll have on the system overall. And the ones at the bottom are easier to employ as leverage points, but don't tend to change the system so much. So as an example, you might think of, say, the New Start allowance. I'm going to steer clear of JobKeeper, JobSeeker. But if you think about the arguments about welfare payments over the last few years, it's been, oh, should they be given, you know, another $50? Should it be this or that? So that's really a conversation about leverage point 12, the numbers and parameters. It's not actually going to drastically change the functioning of the system if we increase or decrease the value that welfare recipients get. It will drastically affect their lives, but it won't affect the system. Whereas if we were to have a conversation about replacing the complex array of subsidies that are put out there with a universal basic income, that would represent a far more drastic change to the system and would be a higher order leverage point, because we'd be starting to change some of the rules and structures that are within the system. So given that, I sort of wondered, well, could I apply this to the influences? Would that help me to make sense even more of what's going on? Would I get some more aha moments? So I went through multiple rounds of reviewing the 40 influences, and you might not be able to see the detail here. That's okay, you don't need to. But I basically reviewed the definitions that I'd worked towards for the influences through the inductive thematic analysis. I reviewed them repeatedly in conjunction with reviewing the Meadows text repeatedly to work out which leverage points might be able to, which influences might be able to operate as system leverage points. And that resulted in this matrix. And you can kind of see that it's a bit clumpy. We don't get like a nice, oh, it's this one or that one. But we do get 7 influences that, if you follow Meadows' argument, have the potential to operate at the highest order of leverage points. So they're up there, and they're on the screen now, you can read. So that's great. That tells us, okay, if we just rank them by the most systemic changing leverage points, this is what we get. But we might want to distinguish those a little more, and I won't get into that now in the sake of, for saving time. But I applied a whole lot of things like weighting different leverage points, counting how many times different influences intersected with different leverage points, coming up with all sorts of weird and wonderful averages. The end result was much the same. So we won't get into the detail of that now, but happy to discuss it offline. We can add that though, and the network mapping, to that earlier table where I had numbers. So all I've done here is replace the numbers with the actual words for the influences. And again, it's kind of a Technicolor dream coat of a lot going on. But the main things to take from that is that if you think about it from a systems perspective, the leadership and cognitive biases sort of were coming through, and that was both when you just did the raw ranking that I showed you and the numerical aspects that I didn't go into. You're getting the same sort of responses. So leadership was coming through really clearly. That also came through on the network mapping. While for the statistical analyses, we're getting that personal characteristics and public decision-making considerations, sort of debates and priorities of decision-making there. So which is most important kind of depends on an analytical approach that you take, because we've got lots of different approaches here, and also who you ask. Okay, that gives us some insights. It sort of led me then to the third question. Well, there's a lot going on here. I can't just keep showing people Technicolor tables with a lot of data. Would a framework help them? And so I asked people, I asked the interviewees, what do you use when you're trying to make a decision? What kind of go-to tools do you have or approaches? And they gave me a series of responses, which I then put to the survey participants, and the survey participants' agreement or disagreement with that is on screen now. And what we can see from that is that the most frequently used approach by the survey participants is this attempt to be fair and balanced, which I've marked as a people-centric approach. That's not a framework, that's just people's kind of, it's a nice ethos to think about. And you've got the little person there to show you all the ones that I've ranked as people-centric. The next one is legislative requirements. That's not developing legislation, that is the legislation's already in place and it requires that I do X. So that is a framework-centric requirement. And you can see that people often or always draw on that as well, so that's good. So there's kind of a bit of a mix there. If you jump down sort of about a third from the bottom, you'll see intuition though, and it's a 50-50 proposition as to whether or not people are sort of often or always operating from their gut or if they're never doing that. And we also see sort of third from the bottom, you can see formal central agency guidance, such as the Victorian Guide to Better Regulation is what that says, which is a guide that supports people to get regulations out of their department through the Minister's Office into the Parliament and approved. So it's somewhat concerning, as again, that we have people that are rarely using that. And again, in the free text, people weren't saying, oh, I rarely use it because I never do regulations. They're just going, oh, I already have my own, I know how the system works. I don't need to look at that guide. So we can kind of conclude that new or imposed frameworks aren't necessarily going to be taken up by people who kind of are accustomed to using their own rules of thumb and their own methods of navigating the bureaucracy. And that I asked people directly as well. Do you believe that public decisions are more influenced by people or by frameworks? And both the survey participants and the interviewees had this 78% response rate of its people. And that came through again in some nice quotes. So there's a quote here from Terry, who was involved in the EREP program. And he basically said it didn't matter what framework was in place. What mattered was what Treasury thought about it. What mattered was what the minister thought about it. And so for them, actually, it came back to the framing of the program to get it through rather than actual frameworks. It was very people-centric. So if we go back to the Technicolor graph, we can also see, if we block out the ones that are framework-centric in black, so you can see them there in black, most of the high impact influences, the things that were coming up regardless of who we spoke to or the systems analysis, are dominated by people-centric influences. So if we're just developing new frameworks and putting them out there, they're unlikely to be taken up by decision makers. It's unlikely to help them to achieve what we're expecting them to. So that kind of made me think, well, we'll probably just then need to bring kind of people-centric. If that's the way they see the world, it's all about people. If we want to introduce rigor and get them to be thinking about things in a particular way, we probably have to do it like a parent sneaks vegetables into their kids' spaghetti. So that's what this image is intended to represent. So there's briefing templates that everyone uses to inform ministers or get things through. It's really easy to add questions to those templates that might help people to drive their thinking around integration or time horizons or broader societal and government expectations than just their one project. Similarly, there might be existing frameworks that we can sort of link to the frameworks we want people to be thinking about. So I didn't encounter PESTLE being used as much in the Victorian public sector, but it was definitely used within the APS. And so it might be as simple as in the template where people have PESTLE and then usually they just have another like empty space where they write what they're doing against that. We can add one more column that shows which SDGs might be relevant to that. And the SDGs shown here as relevant are based purely off which departments which Australian departments have responsibility for which SDG. So that's just a simple little connection drawn there. The other thing that we can do is remind people of that agency that they do have and their ability to influence things, that they're not one little cog in one massive machine and that what they do can only influence so much. Remind them that, yeah, it can only influence so much, but it's still a little bit of influence. It still goes away. So reminding people of that agency can also be important. We can also draw and build on the ideas that decision makers have themselves. So I asked interviewees, what's one change that you would make to enhance the effectiveness or longevity of public decisions? I was trying to get at how they'd enhance intergenerational equity. And they gave me a list of things that you can see on screen, and I put that to the survey participants as well. And again, there's a lot here. I want to draw your attention to just a couple of points because they're instructive when we go to the next solution and sort of next steps from here. So I've put stars against things that relate to evidence, information, and understanding. So we've got an emphasis on evaluation, an outcomes focus, an emphasis on data and engagement and consultation, and an environmental data analytics capability. A lot of people like that idea. And then there's a slightly lighter green star for SEA, which is their System of Environmental Economic Accounting. And the reason that it's got a lighter star is that it was the one response that people just skipped. So they'd either say, yes, I strongly support this, or no, I don't, or they just skip it. So it's sort of, as it's shown there, it undermines how strongly those that did respond to that supported it. And that system is actually changing how people think about the valuation of particular aspects when making decisions. So if we think about these areas of focus, and then if we go back to the systems analysis, some of you might have noticed that under leverage point 7, everything is highlighted. So every influence has the opportunity or the potential to operate as leverage point 7, which is this notion of positive or reinforcing feedback loops. And for me, this was the real aha, light bulb, oh my God, it all makes sense moment. It explained the narrative that I'd heard so many times that this is just the way it is in the public sector, when people were butting their heads up against things that they should be able to change but couldn't. It explained to me why really smart, switched on, passionate people would suddenly switch into these jaded, downbeat, leaving the public sector altogether people when they couldn't make those things seemingly simple but important changes come across the line. And it explained to me why the interdepartmental policy I'd mentioned, like I mentioned way back at the start, why we couldn't deliver the reforms that our stakeholders were saying we needed to deliver, that we knew we needed to deliver. And also reflect sustainable development. It all came together because there's this, okay, the system is constantly pushing us back into what we're doing. It's really hard to overcome that. So if we think about what Meadows argued, which is that those higher order influences have more impact on the system, you can kind of hypothesize or reason that if we were to focus on leverage point 6 around around the structure of information flows, we might be able to overcome some of those positive or reinforcing feedback loops. So rather than having to try to change the feedback loops for all 40 influences and work out which influence is most important, if we just focus on how information is flowing through the system, we might be able to overcome quite a lot of them all at once. And that's not a case of just throwing more numbers and data on the pile, but it's actually thinking about what data do we have? How are people conceptualizing evidence? Who's getting it? Where's it going? How is it analyzed? What is taken up into those decisions? And so you go, okay, I'm buying that. I can go with that. How are we going to do it? And that's where Rob gave away the game at the start of this session. It's potentially with AI. So AI holds a lot of promise. There's a lot of things that it's already been shown to do. There's a lot of private companies out there that are already doing really cool things with it. But what it's missing at the moment is another lens that reflects the decision-making environment from the public sector. And that's something that I and colleagues across MSDI, MDFI, the Faculty of IT and the Better Governance and Policy Initiative are trying to do. We're trying to see whether or not we can find novel ways to alter the information flows using AI so that we can help solve some of those complex problems, such as achievement of sustainable development. Practically, that might look like something like the Menindee Lake system. So the Australian Academy of Science reported that millions of fish died, many of them critically endangered or vulnerable in that fish kill. But using AI, we might have been able to predict that fish kill and send natural resource managers out there to aerate water and to move fish before the kill actually started, before the conditions came into play. So ultimately, natural resource managers did go out there, did aerate water, did move fish, but a large number of fish had already died at that point. Using AI and Earth observations, we might have been able to get there sooner. So that's kind of a preventative, acute approach that we could take. Another kind of broader scale approach that we can take is to think about decisions more holistically. So using AI, we might be able to determine that there's particular activities that happen within the system that when they happen in concert, that's when we get these mega fish kills. And then as a policy officer, you can say, okay, well, that then means that at particular times of the year or with particular seasons or particular La Nina or El Ninos, that means that we can't do this within the system. Maybe we just have to put it on pause for a month, a couple of months, and then the system can go back into flow. So what AI might be able to do is not only make sense of the existing data, but add to it with new sources of data, draw out some of the key variables so that the conversation is shifted from a, oh, it has to be all this or it has to be all that, to a, actually there's more grey, there's more depth of consideration here that can be fed into those decision-making considerations and overcome some of those positive reinforcing feedback loops that have stifled the conversation to date. So that's all pretty promising. There is a key question as to whether or not decision makers will actually see AI as a novel information flow, whether or not they'll see it as just another framework and instead prefer to stick with their trusty hammers that they use all the time. And that's something that I'm trying to explore now. So that's where my research is now. So we're getting short on time. I'm just going to quickly run through the summing up. Basically, people know what sustainable development is. They think about it in different ways that can be mobilized around the Brundtland definition. The SDGs are definitely not in the same level of consciousness, and there's a real danger that people will think, oh, we can just align those with what we're doing without actually going and looking at them in any great detail. There are 40 influences that are pushing decision makers to and from the desired outcome, and that's why they're not getting there. What's most important of those 40 influences depends on who you're asking and how you analyze it, but definitely the people that were focused on sustainable development had a very different view of the world, and so maybe we can learn something from them. Frameworks, even though academics love frameworks, are possibly not really going to help us here, and so we have to think about being a little more crafty as to how we get people to take some of those considerations on board. Systems thinking can help, and hopefully AI can help. And that's about it, really. So thanks a lot for tuning in, and I'm happy to kind of take any questions now or later on. Thanks.
Well, thanks to you, Mitzi. That was a really wonderful presentation, and I just want to make a compliment on just the sheer amount of different kind of methodologies and data you've collected and managed to make sense of. That's very, very impressive. We have little time left, so I'm just going to open up the floor for anyone who wants to ask a question or make a comment. And feel free to just jump in if you want to, or put a question in the chat.
Or mull it over and approach me later, that's fine too.
Maybe while people are waiting, let me pose one question, perhaps our reflection. I guess you've put a lot of thoughts on what kind of factors shape decision making in a public decision making context, and actually how that could be improved. I wonder if this, I mean, these insights are not just applicable to those who want to achieve sustainable development, but I guess also to those who might achieve opposite outcomes, right? So if you look at it from that perspective, is the outcome of political environmental decision making then not the outcome of, let's say, advocates and antagonists trying to play the system at the same time? And how does that fit into your conceptualization? So
yeah, that's a real risk. I think that's why it's nice to present to like-minded people, but also it's where you have to take into account some of those things around framing. And there's a really terrific book called Don't Think of an Elephant by a guy called George Lakoff, where he talks to exactly what you have just described, that people can become aware of these things that might influence in a particular direction, and then other people who have different views come in and kind of take ownership of those ideas and push it in a different way. And so I don't know that there's necessarily a solution to that problem, but I think definitely, and this comes up in that circles expanding or contracting, I think having an awareness of the things that are driving us in particular directions can help decision makers to navigate or become mindful, at least, of that. I know there are certain things that I became aware of through this research that I was like, oh, if I had known that when I was sitting at EPA, I would have done this differently. And so I think it's not entirely answering your question, but increasing awareness of these are the things that are driving you in a particular direction. These are the things that might be able to help you to master them, and use them as enablers rather than barriers, because they can be enablers or barriers, will help those decision makers to reach the end goals that they want.
Thank you.
It's John Thwaites. I'll make a comment and a question. It's to focus on what power the different decision makers have to actually make a difference, given that many public servants are essentially implementing a policy that the government at some level has determined. So I wonder, when you're looking at all of these types of influencing factors, how have you taken that into account? And how do you identify where a public servant really has a discretion to implement sustainable development, or really their job is to implement something that's been decided by someone else?
I think the thing that I learned from this is that you always, it doesn't matter whether or not you are, and I came into the VPS at like the lowest level. It doesn't matter what level you're at, it really is the attitude that you bring to it and the way that you think about it. Because even if you are implementing a policy that the government has set, the way that you do that is up to you. The way that the public experiences that is up to you. And so yes, you have to do that within the realm of what has been committed in the legislation, or the, if it hasn't got to the legislation yet, if it's an election platform, you've got to do it within the realm of the negotiables that have been set there. But there is actually quite often quite a lot of wriggle room as to what you can do. And I think we've talked about this once before as well, that some of the public servants have a bit of a different view as to, okay, the minister has said we've got to do this, but I have this whole bottom drawer of stuff I'd like to do, and some of those things fit that. So I'm going to pull them out now, and I'm going to shape what the minister wants to do here and say, yes, minister, here are 3 options. You can do this, it's safe. You can do this, it's probably going to go with these stakeholders, or you can do this and it's going to set you up to have a legacy as the minister that achieved X, Y, Z. Do you want to go with safe, or do you want to go with establishing your legacy? And again, it would depend on the minister as to which way they want to go, and their mindset. Their mindset is one of those factors, and it's right on the outer edge of the things that people can influence as public servants. But they can influence it. So again, being a bit more aware of who your minister is, what drives them, how open they're likely to be to particular decisions, and how those decisions, or not decisions, ideas, need to be framed so that the minister can hear it and be on board with it, is something that came through quite clearly as well. And it was the people that were more overtly upbeat, yes, I can influence, I can do it here, that kind of were doing that. Whereas other people were more like what you described, of, well, no, this is my role and I focus on this. Yeah.
All right, thank you, Mitzi. Thanks, John, for that question. We've run out of time, so we've got to stop. Some people have already started to jump off. You received some additional compliments, Mitzi, in the chat, so make sure you'll have a look at those before you go off. Thanks again. Thanks everyone for joining, and I'm sure Mitzi will be happy to if you reach out to her afterwards with further questions or thoughts or comments. Thanks everyone.
Thanks everyone. Thanks for the questions.